constitutional basis of the president's power is really pretty narrow. In fact, we see that if we look at the historical writings surrounding the Constitution, the drafting of the Constitution, the ratification of the Constitution, that our founders were anticipating a weak executive. Of course, as we said, that was the consequence of their colonial experience, which was still pretty fresh. Right? They had associated what they perceived as their loss of rights and liberties during the colonial period with abuses of not just the king's authority, but more generally executive authority. The king in the British system of government in the late 18th century was the executive. Right? They had a parliament. They had a legislative branch. And so the king was the executive. So they were so distrustful, the Americans were so distrustful of executive authority. Again, this is a point that we made last time. The Americans were so distrustful of executive authority that during that early national period, the period between independence, when they declared independence in 1776, and the time that the Constitution went into effect in 1789, there was no executive. That's how distrustful they were of executive authority. There was no executive at all. There was no president of the United States during that period. Now, by 1785, certainly 1786, many leading Americans recognized the need for a new constitutional order, and that included creating an executive. And so when the Constitutional Convention met in 1787, most of the plans of government that were submitted, most particularly the Virginia plan, included an executive. And so when the Constitution was drafted, Article 2 of the Constitution would create the presidency. But the extent to which they were willing to vest authority in the presidency was pretty limited. Right? I put up the list. Right? If we look at Article 2, we sort of go through Article 2 and pick out the powers that are specifically delegated to the president. This is the list, right? We went through this list, right? Didn't we not? Okay, yeah, I think I remember us doing that. We said that, first of all, it's a short list. That in and of itself is an indication that they were looking to a weak executive, right? When compared to the list of powers that are delegated to Congress in Article 1. And again, I'll invite you to go out and look at Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, and you can see the powers that are delegated to Congress. It's a much longer list. Not only is it a longer list, it's really a more impressive list, if you think about it. So this is a pretty short list to begin with. And then secondly, we said that most of the powers that are on this list really have to be shared, right? They're not powers that the president exercises unilaterally. He has to share the powers in some way with particularly Congress. And so I remember we sort of went through this list and we talked about how, each of these powers that are vested in the presidency, there's some counterbalancing power vested in Congress. We don't have to go through it again in detail, but just to refresh your memory, what did we say, for example, with the counterbalance? Let's see, first on the list, chief executive. What's the counterbalancing power that Congress has with respect to the president's power as chief executive? Article 2 says, he shall be chief executive and take care that the laws be faithfully executed. So if Congress does not like the way that the president is executing the law, if Congress believes that, if the membership of Congress believes that the president's not faithfully executing the law consistent with the intent of Congress, what recourse does Congress have? They can rewrite the law, write new law, providing more guidance, stricter parameters. And I think the example that I gave you to illustrate that, there are many examples, but I think, if I remember correctly, the example that I gave you to illustrate that was 1974, Congress passed the Budget Impoundment Control Act. Right? That was during the Nixon administration, because Nixon had sort of gone overboard with the use of the impoundment power. And so Congress essentially concluded that, look, when we appropriate money, we expect it to be spent. We create these programs, we appropriate money for them, we expect the money to be spent. It's not really the president's prerogative to shoot down the will of Congress by simply refusing to spend money. So therefore, we're going to write legislation which severely curtails the president's ability to impound funds. That was really the purpose of the Budget Impoundment Control. It's sort of the same, it was really the same motivation that Congress had in 1973 when it passed over President Nixon's veto the War Powers Act. Maybe you remember reading about the War Powers Act in the textbook. That's also a very significant piece of legislation that was passed by Congress at about the same time. The Budget Impoundment Control Act was 1974. The War Powers Act was 1973. By the way, Richard Nixon vetoed both of those, and Congress overrode both of those vetoes. I said previously that congressional overrides vetoes are pretty rare, but in that period, Congress overrode Nixon's veto on two very significant bits of legislation, the Budget Impoundment Control Act and the War Powers Act. And basically what Congress was trying to do in the War Powers Act was rein in the president's war-making power. So they had sort of reached the conclusion that a succession of presidents, not just Nixon, but certainly during the Nixon administration, had gotten the United States into war-making situations without really getting Congress's approval. And they wanted to curtail the president's ability to get in future instances, get the United States involved in war-making activities.